When a dying stranger collapsed on Rosalind Hayes' doorstep in the Wyoming Territory of 1879, she gave him the only thing she had: a cup of water from her well. But what she didn't know was that Benjamin Caldwell owned every major ranch stretching across the endless prairie, and his final act would transform a struggling pregnant widow into the most powerful landowner in the territory if she could survive the deadly consequences of inheriting an empire built on secrets. The morning sun burned across the Wyoming Territory like a giant orange eye watching everything below. Rosalind Hayes wiped sweat from her face as she carried water from the well to her tiny vegetable garden. It was the summer of 1879, and the heat made everything harder than it already was. Her hands shook as she poured water on the dying tomato plants. At 22 years old, she felt much older. The baby growing inside her belly made her back ache, and worry ate at her thoughts like hungry wolves. Her husband had been dead for 3 months now, killed when his horse threw him during a storm. The town doctor said the baby would come with the first snow, but Rosalind didn't know how she would feed another mouth. The nearest neighbors lived 15 miles away, and the closest town was 30 miles east. Out here on the prairie, a person could disappear, and nobody would know for weeks. Sometimes Rosalind went days without hearing another human voice except her own when she talked to the chickens. She touched the small wooden cross that hung around her neck. It had belonged to her grandmother, the only family member who had ever shown her kindness. Everyone else in her family thought she was foolish for marrying a poor rancher and moving to this empty land. Now that he was gone, she wondered if they had been right. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. Rosalind loved that smell, even though it reminded her how alone she was. The prairie stretched out in every direction like a green ocean, beautiful but dangerous. Wild animals, sudden storms, and harsh winters could kill a person faster than they could blink. Her small cabin sat beside a creek that never ran dry, which was why her husband had chosen this spot. The water was clean and cold, even in summer. It was probably the most valuable thing she owned now that the bank wanted money for her husband's debts. As she walked back toward the house, something caught her eye. Far out on the horizon, a dark spot moved slowly across the grassland. At first, she thought it might be a buffalo, but it was too small. Maybe a rider. But they were moving strangely, like they might be hurt. Rosalind shaded her eyes with her hand and watched. The figure stumbled and fell, then got up and kept moving toward her creek. Her heart started beating faster. Out here, strangers could mean trouble, but they could also mean someone who needed help. She went inside and got her husband's rifle from above the fireplace. She wasn't a great shot, but she knew how to load it and pull the trigger. Her hands trembled as she checked to make sure it was ready. Looking out the window, she watched the stranger get closer. It was definitely a man, and he was definitely hurt. His clothes looked expensive, not like the rough work clothes most men wore out here. He walked like every step caused him pain. When he was about 100 yards from her cabin, the man fell again. This time, he didn't get up. He lay still beside the creek, and Rosalind couldn't tell if he was breathing. She stood at her door for a long minute, holding the rifle and trying to decide what to do. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Child, when someone needs help, you help them. That's what separates good people from bad ones." Taking a deep breath, Rosalind set the rifle by the door and walked toward the fallen stranger. As she got closer, she could see that he was bleeding. His expensive suit was torn and dirty, and his face was pale as winter snow. The man's eyes opened when her shadow fell across him. They were blue like deep water, and they looked at her with desperation that made her chest tight. "Please," he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Water." Rosalind knelt beside the stranger, her dress getting wet from the creek bank mud. Up close, she could see that he was probably around 40 years old, with gray starting to show in his brown hair. Whatever had happened to him, it was bad. Dark red stains covered the front of his white shirt, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. "Don't try to move," she said, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. "You're hurt, pretty bad." The man's eyes focused on her face, with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. It was like he was trying to memorize what she looked like. His lips were cracked and dry, and when he tried to speak again, only a croaking sound came out. Rosalind hurried to the creek and filled the tin cup she always kept there for drinking. The water was cold and clear, tasting of minerals from deep underground. She lifted the stranger's head gently and brought the cup to his lips. He drank like a man who had been lost in the desert for days. Water ran down his chin and onto his torn shirt, but he kept drinking until the cup was empty. When he finished, he laid his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was stronger now. "I thought I was going to die without ever tasting water again." "What happened to you?" Rosalind asked. She could see now that the blood was coming from his side, where his shirt was torn open. It looked like he had been shot or stabbed. "Bandits," the man said through gritted teeth. "3 of them, about 10 miles south of here. They wanted my horse and my money. I gave them both, but they decided to have some fun with me anyway." Rosalind felt anger rise in her chest. She had heard stories about men who robbed travelers on the lonely roads between towns. Most people said it was getting worse as more folks moved west looking for land and gold. "We need to get you inside," she said. "You're losing too much blood out here." The stranger tried to sit up and immediately fell back with a groan. "I don't think I can walk, miss. Maybe you should just leave me here and go get help from town." "Town is 30 miles away," Rosalind replied. "You'd be dead long before I got back with a doctor." She looked at the man more carefully. Despite the blood and dirt, she could tell his clothes were expensive. His boots were made of fine leather, and she could see a gold chain across his vest. Rich folks didn't usually travel alone through empty country without guards or guides. "What's your name?" she asked. The man hesitated for just a moment, like he was deciding whether to tell her the truth. "Benjamin," he said finally. "Benjamin Caldwell." Something about the way he said it made Rosalind think she should know that name, but she couldn't place it. Rich people were mostly just stories to her, names in newspapers that sometimes made it out to the settlements. "Well, Mr. Caldwell, I'm Rosalind Hayes, and right now you're on my land. That means I'm responsible for what happens to you." Benjamin Caldwell's eyes widened slightly when she said her name was Hayes. "You're married?" "I'm a widow," Rosalind said, not sure why she was telling a complete stranger her personal business. Maybe it was because he looked so helpless lying there, or maybe it was because she hadn't talked to another person in over a week. "I'm sorry for your loss," Benjamin said, and he sounded like he really meant it. "How long?" 3 months now. Rosalind stood up and brushed mud off her dress. "But we're not talking about me right now. We need to figure out how to get you patched up." She could see that Benjamin was studying her face again, paying particular attention to her belly, where the baby was starting to show. Most men would look away when they noticed a woman was expecting, but he kept staring like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're going to have a child," he said. "That's not your concern, Mr. Caldwell." Rosalind felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What is my concern is keeping you from bleeding to death in my front yard." Benjamin smiled for the first time since she'd found him. It changed his whole face, making him look younger and less like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You're a good woman, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Better than I deserve, probably." "I don't know anything about what you deserve," Rosalind replied. "But my grandmother always said that when someone needs help, you help them. That's just what decent people do." Something flickered across Benjamin's face when she said that, like her words had hit him somewhere deep inside. He reached into his jacket pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out a thick leather folder. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice getting weaker again, "if something happens to me, I want you to have this. It's important." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Rosalind said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But even as she spoke the words, she could see that Benjamin Caldwell was fading fast. His skin was getting paler by the minute, and the blood wasn't stopping despite the pressure she was trying to put on his wounds. What was in that leather folder that made him think a stranger should have it? The storm hit just as Rosalind dragged Benjamin Caldwell through her cabin door. Lightning turned the small room white for a split second, and in that flash she saw something that made her heart skip. This wasn't just any man bleeding on her floor. His clothes were fancy, fancier than anything she'd ever seen in person. The fabric of his jacket felt smooth as river stones under her fingers, and his boots were made of leather so fine it still held its shine despite the dust and blood. A gold pocket watch hung from a chain across his vest, ticking steadily like a heartbeat. "Mr. Caldwell, can you hear me?" Rosalind pressed a clean cloth against the worst of his wounds. The bleeding seemed to be slowing, but his skin felt cold as winter morning. "The papers," he whispered, his eyes fighting to stay open. "In my coat pocket. You have to find them." Rosalind hesitated. Going through a dying man's pockets felt wrong, like stealing from a grave. But something in his voice made her listen. Her fingers found a thick leather folder tucked inside his jacket. "What are these?" she asked. But Benjamin's breathing had grown shallow and fast. Thunder crashed overhead as she spread the papers across her kitchen table. The candlelight flickered, making the words dance on the pages. Property deed after property deed, each one stamped with official seals and signatures. Windmill Ranch, 20,000 acres. Eagle Creek Holdings, 215,000 acres. Silver Valley Ranch, HA, 30,000 acres. Her mouth went dry as she counted. Page after page of land ownership papers, all signed with the same name in careful handwriting. Benjamin Caldwell. "You own all this?" she whispered, turning back toward the bed. But Benjamin was staring at the ceiling now, his chest barely moving. She rushed to his side, taking his cold hand in both of hers. "Why did you want me to find these?" she asked. His eyes found hers one last time. "Because," he said, each word taking great effort, "a woman who gives water to a dying stranger deserves more than the world has given her." "I don't understand." Benjamin's grip tightened slightly on her hand. "The last paper," he breathed. "Look at the last paper." Rosalind hurried back to the table, her hands shaking as she flipped through the documents. The final page was different from the others. Instead of a property deed, it was a letter written in the same careful handwriting. "To whoever finds these papers," it began, "I, Benjamin Caldwell, being of sound mind but failing body, do hereby leave all my earthly possessions to the person who showed me kindness in my final hours. The lawyers will argue, my sister will fight, but this is my final wish. The land should belong to someone who understands that true wealth comes from the size of one's heart, not the size of one's bank account." Rosalind's legs gave out, and she sank into her wooden chair. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside her small cabin, everything had gone perfectly still. She looked back at Benjamin, but his chest had stopped moving entirely. The great landowner of Wyoming territory had died in her bed, leaving her everything he owned. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the papers that could change her life forever. Then she thought about her baby, growing inside her, and what kind of future she could give a child, with nothing but a broken-down cabin and a handful of chickens. Carefully, like she was handling something made of glass, Rosalind folded the papers and tucked them under her mattress. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. As the storm began to calm outside, she wrapped Benjamin Caldwell in her best blanket and said a prayer for his soul. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out what to do with a dead man and a fortune she never asked for. But tonight, she sat by the window and watched the rain wash the blood from her doorstep, wondering if sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. 3 weeks later, Rosalind heard the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt path to her cabin. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing that sooner or later, someone would come looking for Benjamin Caldwell. She watched from behind her curtain as a fancy black carriage pulled up outside. The horses were the finest she'd ever seen, with coats that gleamed like polished metal. A thin man, in a dark suit, climbed down first, adjusting his spectacles and looking around like he'd never seen such a poor place before. Then a woman stepped out, and Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. The lady wore a dress that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Her hair was piled high on her head, and even from a distance, Rosalind could see the cold look in her pale eyes. "Mrs. Hayes?" The man called out, his voice sharp and unfriendly. "I am Attorney Pemberton from Cheyenne. This is Mrs. Evelyn Caldwell. We need to speak with you about her brother." Rosalind's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She'd known this day would come, but she still wasn't ready. Her hand moved to her growing belly, where the baby seemed to sense her fear and began kicking. She opened the door, trying to look calmer than she felt. "What can I do for you?" Evelyn Caldwell stepped forward, and Rosalind could see she was the kind of woman who expected everyone to move out of her way. "We understand my brother died on your property. We've come to collect his belongings and settle his affairs." The way she said "settle" made Rosalind's skin crawl. It sounded like a threat wrapped up in fancy words. "He's buried in the cemetery behind the cabin," Rosalind said quietly. "I gave him a proper burial," said words over his grave. Attorney Pemberton pulled out a notebook and began writing. "Did Mr. Caldwell have any possessions with him when he died? Jewelry, papers, anything of value?" Rosalind felt the weight of the hidden documents under her mattress, like they were made of lead. "Just his clothes and a pocket watch." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "My brother was carrying important business documents when he left Cheyenne. Legal papers related to his ranches. They're worth nothing to you, but they're essential for settling his estate." "I don't know anything about business papers," Rosalind lied, hoping her voice sounded steady. "Of course you don't," Evelyn said with a cold smile. "You're just a simple farm woman. But those papers belong to the Caldwell family, and we intend to have them back." Attorney Pemberton stepped closer. "Mrs. Hayes, hiding legal documents is a serious crime. If you have anything that belonged to Mr. Caldwell, you need to turn it over immediately." Rosalind felt trapped between telling the truth and protecting herself. If she gave them the papers, her baby would grow up poor, just like she had. But if she kept them, she might go to jail. "I told you I don't have any papers," she said again. Evelyn walked around the small cabin, peering in the windows like she owned the place. "This is quite a poor little homestead you have here. It must be hard, living alone with a baby coming. I imagine you'd do almost anything to change your situation." The threat in her words was as clear as daylight. Rosalind straightened her shoulders and looked Evelyn directly in the eyes. "I make an honest living, Mrs. Caldwell. I don't need charity from anyone." "Charity?" Evelyn laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Oh, my dear, you misunderstand. I'm not offering charity. I'm simply pointing out that accidents happen to people who live so far from town, especially people who might have something that doesn't belong to them." Attorney Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "What my client means is that we're prepared to search the premises if necessary. We have legal authority to recover Mr. Caldwell's property." Rosalind's mind raced. She needed time to think, to figure out what to do. "I'll look around," she said finally. "Maybe something got mixed in with my things when I was taking care of him. Come back tomorrow, and I'll let you know what I find." Evelyn's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "How reasonable of you. We'll return tomorrow morning, and I'm sure you'll have found exactly what we're looking for." As the carriage rolled away, Rosalind sank onto her front step, her legs shaking. She had less than 24 hours to decide what to do with papers that could either save her future or destroy her life. Looking out at the endless prairie grass, she realized that sometimes the biggest choices come disguised as the smallest moments. Fire crackled in the stone fireplace as Attorney Pemberton spread the mysterious papers across Rosalind's wooden table like a deck of cards that could change everything. The autumn wind howled outside, making the cabin walls creak and groan like an old ship in a storm. "These documents are fake," Evelyn Caldwell announced, her voice cutting through the room like a sharp knife. She stood tall in her fancy black dress, looking completely out of place in the simple cabin. Her pale eyes studied each paper with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. Rosalind felt her heart beating fast as she watched the elegant woman examine Benjamin's final gift. The baby inside her belly seemed to sense the tension, kicking restlessly as if trying to escape the dangerous situation. My brother was dying when he supposedly signed these, Evelyn continued, picking up one of the deeds with 2 fingers, as if it might bite her. A man losing blood can't think straight. Whatever crazy things he told you don't matter in a court of law. Attorney Pemberton adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled out a small magnifying glass from his leather case. He moved slowly and carefully, examining each signature like a detective searching for clues. The silence stretched on forever, broken only by the ticking of Rosalind's old clock and the sound of Evelyn's fancy boots tapping impatiently on the wooden floor. I found these papers exactly where he told me to look, Rosalind said, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice-cold fingers. Benjamin wasn't talking crazy. His eyes were clear when he spoke to me. Evelyn laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter and cold, like winter wind through bare trees. Do you honestly think anyone will believe such a ridiculous story? My brother owned more land than most kings. He built his empire over 20 years of hard work and smart business deals. She walked to the window and stared out at the prairie, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Benjamin never married, never had children, never even kept a pet. The idea that he would leave everything to a complete stranger is absolutely impossible. But Rosalind noticed something interesting. Despite her harsh words, Evelyn's hands were shaking slightly as she spoke. The confident mask was starting to slip, revealing worry underneath like cracks in expensive paint. Attorney Pemberton suddenly went very quiet. He was studying one particular document with such intense focus that his forehead wrinkled like an accordion. When he finally looked up, his face had turned pale as fresh snow. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully, like stepping stones across a dangerous river. "This appears to be a properly witnessed deathbed addition to your brother's original will." Evelyn spun around so fast her dress rustled like autumn leaves. "What are you talking about?" "The signature matches perfectly with samples I have in my files," Pemberton explained, his voice growing more excited with each word. "And look here, 2 witnesses signed as well. If this document is real, it would cancel out all previous arrangements." Rosalind felt a spark of hope flicker to life in her chest, like a candle being lit in a dark room. But Evelyn's face twisted with rage, her elegant features becoming sharp and dangerous. "Those could be forged signatures," she snapped. "Any skilled criminal could copy my brother's handwriting. I demand that document be examined by experts in Denver." The attorney nodded thoughtfully. "That can certainly be arranged, but until then, these papers must be treated as potentially valid legal documents." Evelyn's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. She looked at Rosalind with such hatred that it felt like being stared at by a hungry wolf. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, girl. My family has connections throughout this territory. Judges, sheriffs, business owners. It's owe us favors." "Are you threatening me?" Rosalind asked, surprised by her own boldness. "I'm stating facts," Evelyn replied smoothly. "Life can be very difficult for people who make enemies of the wrong families, especially for pregnant women living alone in dangerous places like this." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Rosalind realized that her simple act of kindness had thrust her into a battle she never wanted to fight. But looking at Evelyn's cruel smile, she also understood that backing down now would mean losing everything, not just for herself, but for her unborn child. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance like the sound of approaching war drums, and Rosalind knew that the real fight was just beginning. Smoke filled Rosalind's lungs as she jolted awake to the smell of burning wood and the terrified squawking of chickens outside her cabin. The orange glow dancing across her bedroom wall told her immediately that something was very, very wrong. She stumbled outside in her nightgown, her pregnant belly making her clumsy as she grabbed the water buckets from beside her door. Her small barn was completely covered in flames that reached toward the dark sky like angry fingers trying to grab the stars. The chickens ran in circles, their feathers singed and their voices filled with panic. Rosalind tried desperately to throw bucket after bucket of water onto the fire, but it was like trying to stop a river with her bare hands. The flames were too big, too hungry, too determined to destroy everything she owned. That's when she saw her, Evelyn Caldwell, sitting on her horse up on the ridge above the property, watching the destruction with a satisfied smile on her face, like someone enjoying a particularly good play at the theater. "Accidents happen so easily out here," Evelyn called down, her voice carrying clearly through the smoky air, "especially to women who live alone and make poor decisions about legal matters." Rosalind felt her fear transform into something much stronger and more dangerous, pure, burning anger. She thought about Benjamin Caldwell dying in her arms, grateful for nothing more than a cup of cool water. She thought about the baby growing inside her, depending on her for protection and safety. "Perhaps you should think more carefully about those documents you claim to have found," Evelyn continued, guiding her horse closer to the edge of the ridge. "Sometimes the wisest choice is to simply walk away from situations that are too big for us to handle." But instead of feeling defeated, Rosalind discovered something surprising about herself. The fire that was destroying her barn had somehow lit a different kind of fire inside her heart, the determination to fight back no matter what the cost. By dawn, her barn was nothing but smoking ruins and scattered ashes. Most of her chickens had escaped, though several bore singed feathers as proof of their narrow escape from death. Rosalind stood in the wreckage, her nightgown dirty with soot and her hands black from trying to save what couldn't be saved. But her mind was clear and focused like never before. She saddled her mare and rode hard toward the nearest settlement, her pregnant belly bouncing uncomfortably with each gallop. The town of Riverside was 30 miles away, but she pushed her horse faster than she'd ever dared before. The telegraph office was barely open when she arrived, dust-covered and exhausted. The operator, a thin man with kind eyes, looked concerned as she stumbled through the door. "I need to send an urgent message to the territorial capital," she announced, placing her few precious coins on the wooden counter. "It's about a legal matter involving the Caldwell estate." As she carefully dictated her message, requesting federal investigators and document experts, Rosalind realized something important had changed inside her. She was no longer the scared, uncertain widow who had given water to a dying stranger. The woman standing in this telegraph office was someone new, someone willing to fight for what was right, no matter how powerful her enemies might be. The telegraph operator's fingers moved quickly across the keys, sending her words racing along the wires toward Denver and beyond. Each click and tap sounded like a small victory, a declaration that she would not be intimidated or driven away. "Message sent, ma'am," the operator said with an encouraging smile. "Should get a response within 2 days." Rosalind thanked him and walked back outside, where her horse waited patiently in the morning sunshine. As she climbed into the saddle, she noticed something that made her heart skip with hope. A federal marshal's badge gleaming on the vest of a tall man who was studying a piece of paper outside the general store. Maybe, just maybe, help was already on its way. The ride back to her cabin felt different somehow. Even though her barn was gone and Evelyn Caldwell was probably planning her next attack, Rosalind no longer felt alone and helpless. She had taken the first step in what would surely be the most important battle of her life. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind Judge Hawthorne as he entered the packed courtroom in Medicine Bow. Every seat was filled with ranchers, shopkeepers, and curious townspeople who had traveled from across the territory to witness something nobody had ever seen before: a pregnant widow claiming she owned half of Wyoming. Rosalind sat at the wooden table, her hands folded over her swollen belly. Her simple brown dress looked plain, next to Attorney Pemberton's fancy suit. But her eyes held a strength that made several people in the crowd lean forward to get a better look. This court will now hear the case of Caldwell versus Hayes, Judge Hawthorne announced, his voice echoing off the walls. Mrs. Evelyn Caldwell claims that her deceased brother's will was changed illegally. Mrs. Rosalind Hayes says the changes are real and legal. Attorney Pemberton stood up first. He was a tall, thin man who looked like he had never worked a day outside in his life. His voice was smooth as butter when he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen of this court, we are here today because of a ridiculous claim. Benjamin Caldwell was one of the richest men in all of Wyoming territory. He owned more cattle than anyone could count and more land than some small countries. He was a smart businessman who made every decision carefully. Pemberton walked around the courtroom, looking at the faces in the crowd. Now we are supposed to believe that this wealthy, careful man suddenly decided to give everything he owned to a complete stranger? A woman he had never met before? A woman who has no money, no family connections, and no experience running a business? Several people in the crowd nodded their heads. It did sound pretty strange when he put it that way. Benjamin Caldwell was bleeding and hurt when he stumbled onto Mrs. Hayes' property. He was probably seeing things that weren't there. Maybe he was having bad dreams. Sick people often say things that don't make sense. The law cannot allow a confused, dying man's wild words to steal an entire fortune from his real family. Evelyn Caldwell sat in the front row, dressed in black silk that probably cost more than most people made in a year. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, but Rosalind noticed that her tears looked fake. Then it was time for Rosalind's lawyer to speak. His name was Mr. Daniel Warren, and he had traveled all the way from Cheyenne after receiving Rosalind's telegram. Unlike Pemberton, Warren was a shorter man with calloused hands who looked like he understood what it meant to work hard for a living. Your Honor, Warren began, the law is very clear about deathbed wills. If a dying person is thinking clearly and has witnesses, they can change their will right up until their last breath. The question is not whether Benjamin Caldwell was rich or whether Mrs. Hayes was a stranger. The question is whether he was thinking clearly when he made this decision. Warren walked over to Rosalind's table and picked up a thick folder. I have here the testimony of two traveling merchants, John Foster and William McKinney. These men stopped at Mrs. Hayes's cabin on the same night that Benjamin Caldwell died. They both swear that Mr. Caldwell was awake, alert, and speaking clearly when he signed the new will. A murmur went through the courtroom. This was new information that many people hadn't heard before. Furthermore, Warren continued, we have examined the handwriting on the new will. 3 different handwriting experts have confirmed that the signature belongs to Benjamin Caldwell. There is no question that he wrote it himself. Judge Hawthorne called for the first witness. John Foster walked to the front of the courtroom. He was a weathered man in his 50s who sold tools and supplies to remote farms and ranches. Mr. Foster, Warren asked, please tell the court what you saw on the night of August 15, 1879. Foster cleared his throat. My partner Bill and I were traveling through the territory with our wagon. We stopped at Mrs. Hayes' cabin, asking if we could sleep in her barn. She said yes, even though she didn't have much to share. Was anyone else there that night? Yes, sir. There was a man in her cabin. He was hurt pretty bad, but he was definitely awake. Mrs. Hayes was taking care of him, giving him water and trying to make him comfortable. Did you see this man sign any papers? Yes, sir. He asked Mrs. Hayes to bring him some papers from his coat. Then he asked Bill and me to come inside and watch him sign something. He said he wanted witnesses. Did he seem confused or unclear about what he was doing? Foster shook his head firmly. No, sir. He knew exactly what he was doing. He even read parts of the papers out loud to make sure we understood what we were witnessing. He said Mrs. Hayes had shown him kindness when nobody else would, and he wanted to make sure she and her baby would be taken care of. Pemberton jumped up from his chair. Objection, Your Honor. This witness cannot know what Mr. Caldwell was thinking. I'm only repeating what the man said with his own words, Foster replied calmly. Judge Hawthorne nodded. The witness may continue. Warren had Foster describe everything he remembered about that night in detail. Then William McKinney took the witness stand and told the same story. Their accounts matched perfectly. When it was Pemberton's turn to question the witnesses, he tried hard to make them seem unreliable. He asked if they had been drinking that night, if the light in the cabin was good enough to see clearly, and if they really understood what kind of papers they were signing. But both men stuck to their story. They had been sober. The oil lamp gave plenty of light, and Benjamin Caldwell had explained everything clearly. Then Rosalind was called to testify. As she walked to the witness chair, every person in the courtroom watched her. Some faces looked curious, others looked doubtful, and a few looked downright hostile. Warren asked her to tell her story from the beginning. Rosalind's voice was quiet but clear, as she described finding Benjamin Caldwell by the creek, helping him into her cabin, and giving him water. He was hurt badly, she said, but his mind was clear. He knew his name, he knew where he was, and he knew he was dying. He kept thanking me for the water and asking about my baby. What did he say about the papers? He told me to look in his coat pocket. When I found them, he made me spread them out on the table. He looked through them all carefully, even though it was hard for him to move. Then he asked if there was paper and ink in the cabin, so he could write something new. Did you understand what he was writing? Rosalind nodded. He explained it to me. He said I had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. He said that kind of goodness was rare in the world, and people like me deserved to be rewarded. What exactly did he say about inheriting his property? Rosalind looked directly at Judge Hawthorne as she answered. He said, "A woman who would give water to a dying stranger is the kind of person who should inherit the earth. I'm giving you my earth, Mrs. Hayes. Use it well." A gasp went through the courtroom. Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Pemberton stood up for his cross-examination. He tried to make Rosalind look like a liar who had taken advantage of a sick man. He asked harsh questions about her late husband's debts and suggested that she had stolen the papers from Caldwell's body. But Rosalind answered every question calmly and honestly. She admitted that she needed money and that inheriting the ranches would solve her problems. But she insisted that she had never asked Benjamin Caldwell for anything, except to let her help him. "Mrs. Hayes," Pemberton said in his most threatening voice, "do you really expect this court to believe that a complete stranger would leave you millions of dollars worth of property just for giving him a drink of water?" Rosalind was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Pemberton, I think you've never been dying and thirsty at the same time. If you had, you might understand that a cup of water can be worth more than all the money in the world." The courtroom was completely silent. Even Judge Hawthorne seemed moved by her words. After all the witnesses had testified, both lawyers made their final arguments. Pemberton insisted that the will was either forged or the product of a confused mind. Warren argued that Benjamin Caldwell had made a clear, legal decision that should be honored. Judge Hawthorne announced that he would need time to consider all the evidence. The court would reconvene the following morning for his decision. That night, Rosalind barely slept. She could hear people talking outside her hotel room, discussing the case and arguing about what the judge should decide. Some voices sounded supportive, but others were clearly angry at the idea of a poor widow suddenly becoming one of the richest people in the territory. What would happen if she lost the case? Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Judge Hawthorne entered the courtroom carrying a thick folder of papers. The room was even more crowded than the day before, with people standing along the walls and craning their necks to see over the heads in front of them. Rosalind felt her baby kick strongly inside her belly, as if the little one knew that this moment would decide their entire future. Her hands were shaking as she folded them on the table in front of her. Judge Hawthorne sat down heavily in his chair and looked out at the packed courtroom. "I have spent most of the night reading through all the evidence in this case," he began. "I have also sent telegrams to several legal experts in Denver and Chicago to make sure I understand the law correctly." He picked up the first paper from his folder. "The question before this court is simple. Did Benjamin Caldwell have the legal right to change his will on the night he died? And was he mentally capable of making such an important decision? Evelyn Caldwell leaned forward in her seat, her face tight with worry. Attorney Pemberton sat perfectly still, but Rosalind could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. After careful consideration, Judge Hawthorne continued, "I find that the evidence clearly shows Benjamin Caldwell was thinking clearly on the night of August 15th, 1879. Two reliable witnesses have testified that he read the documents carefully, explained his decisions clearly, and signed the new will without any confusion or pressure from Mrs. Hayes." A buzz of excited whispers filled the courtroom, but the judge held up his hand for silence. "However," he said, and Rosalind's heart seemed to stop beating, "there is another important question that must be answered. Mrs. Caldwell's lawyers have argued that the original will should remain in effect because Mrs. Hayes used unfair influence to convince a dying man to change his legal documents." Rosalind felt like she might be sick. She had never tried to influence Benjamin Caldwell in any way. She had simply tried to help a hurt person. Judge Hawthorne opened another paper. "I have here a report from Dr. Samuel Martinez, who examined Mr. Caldwell's body after his death. Dr. Martinez confirms that Mr. Caldwell died from internal injuries, probably caused by being thrown from his horse. The doctor also states that this type of injury would not have affected Mr. Caldwell's ability to think clearly." The judge paused and looked directly at Rosalind. "Mrs. Hayes, would you please stand?" Rosalind's legs felt weak as she pushed herself up from her chair. Every person in the courtroom was staring at her, and she could feel her face turning red. "Mrs. Hayes, I want you to tell this court exactly what you asked Mr. Caldwell for during the time he was in your cabin." Rosalind's voice was barely above a whisper when she answered, "Nothing, Your Honor. I never asked him for anything." "Did you know who he was when you found him?" "No, sir. He was just a hurt man who needed help." "Did you know he was wealthy?" "Not until after he died and I looked at the papers he told me to find." Judge Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Mrs. Hayes, what did you give Mr. Caldwell during the time he was in your care?" "Water, sir, and a place to rest. I tried to make him as comfortable as possible." "Did you ask for payment for this care?" "Oh, no, sir. He was hurt and dying. It would have been wrong to ask for money." Judge Hawthorne turned back to the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have been a judge for 15 years. In that time, I have seen many cases involving disputed wills. Usually, these cases involve family members fighting over money, or people who befriended wealthy individuals hoping to be included in their wills." He held up the leather portfolio containing Benjamin Caldwell's papers. "This case is different. Mrs. Hayes did not seek out Benjamin Caldwell. She did not know he was wealthy. She did not ask him for anything. She simply showed basic human kindness to a stranger who was suffering." The judge's voice grew stronger. "Benjamin Caldwell was a successful businessman who spent 20 years building his cattle empire. He was known throughout the territory as a man who made careful, intelligent decisions. There is no evidence that he was confused or pressured when he decided to change his will." Evelyn Caldwell made a small choking sound, and Rosalind saw her grab the arm of her chair as if she might faint. "Furthermore," Judge Hawthorne continued, "I find Mr. Caldwell's reasoning to be sound. He chose to leave his property to someone who had demonstrated the kind of character he valued: kindness, generosity, and care for others without expectation of reward." The judge stood up, and everyone in the courtroom stood up with him. "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that the will dated August 15th, 1879, is legal and valid. The entire estate of Benjamin Caldwell, including all properties, livestock, and financial assets, passes to Mrs. Rosalind Hayes." The courtroom exploded in noise. Some people cheered and clapped, while others shouted in anger or disbelief. Rosalind sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the reality that her life had just changed completely. Attorney Warren shook her hand and congratulated her, but his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Through the crowd, she could see Evelyn Caldwell being helped toward the door by Attorney Pemberton. her face white with shock and rage. Over the next few weeks, Rosalind learned just how much Benjamin Caldwell had owned. The windmill ranch alone covered more than 50,000 acres and housed over 10,000 head of cattle. Eagle Creek holdings included not just land, but also mining rights to several silver deposits in the mountains. Silver Valley Ranch was smaller, but had the best water rights in the territory. The total value of her inheritance was more money than she could have imagined in her wildest dreams. But with the wealth came enormous responsibility and countless decisions that she had no experience making. Fortunately, most of Benjamin Caldwell's employees chose to stay and help her learn the business. The ranch foreman taught her about cattle breeding and seasonal grazing patterns. The bookkeepers showed her how to read financial records and plan budgets. The miners explained how to evaluate ore samples and negotiate with buyers in Denver and San Francisco. Rosalind moved into the main house at Windmill Ranch just before her baby was born. On a snowy February night in 1880, with the help of Dr. Martinez and 2 experienced midwives, she gave birth to a healthy daughter. As she held her tiny daughter for the first time, Rosalind thought about the strange path that had brought them to this moment. 9 months earlier, she had been a struggling widow with no idea how she would survive. Now, she was one of the most powerful landowners in Wyoming territory, able to provide her child with every advantage in life. But she also remembered Benjamin Caldwell's words about the kind of person who deserved to inherit the earth. Wealth and power were not rewards for their own sake. They were tools that could be used to help others or to cause harm. Rosalind decided to name her daughter Grace, because grace was what she had received from a dying stranger, and grace was what she hoped to show to others. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing new grass to the endless prairies. Rosalind stood on the porch of her grand house, watching her ranch hands prepare for the busy season ahead. Her baby slept peacefully in her arms, tiny fingers wrapped around Rosalind's thumb. A rider approached from the east, carrying mail from town. Among the letters was one with an elegant return address, the office of the Governor of Wyoming Territory. Inside, Rosalind found an invitation to serve on a new territorial committee focused on improving schools and medical care in remote areas. She smiled as she read the letter. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Benjamin Caldwell had probably hoped she would use his legacy to pursue. As the sun set over her vast holdings, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Rosalind felt a deep sense of peace. She had learned that true wealth was not measured in acres or cattle or bank accounts, but in the connections between people who chose to care for one another. Her daughter stirred in her arms, opening bright blue eyes that seemed to look right into Rosalind's soul. This little girl would grow up knowing that the greatest inheritance anyone could receive was not money or property, but the knowledge that every person has the power to change someone else's life through simple acts of kindness. The prairie wind carried the scent of new flowers and distant rain, promising another season of growth and possibility. And Rosalind Hayes, now Rosalind Caldwell, knew that she was finally completely ready for whatever the future might bring.